The Biden administration is imposing new sanctions on Cuba after its violent crackdown on anti-government protesters earlier this month. Thousands took to the streets demanding the end of the decades-long communist regime. President Biden called Cuba, quote, a failed state that is repressing its citizens. The sanctions issued Thursday target the Cuban Minister of Defense as well as the Cuban Interior Ministry Special Brigade. Today, in a statement, Secretary of State Antony Blinken said the United States and the international community will continue to provide support to the Cuban people as they seek to exercise those universal human rights and freedoms to which all individuals are entitled. Joining us now is Russell Contreras. He's a race and justice reporter for Axios. So, Russell, let's talk about what these sanctions mean for Cuba. Will they have an impact?
Well, that's the big question here. We don't know. What we do know is that these are the largest demonstrations in Cuba in decades. They're occurring not just in Havana, but they're occurring in Santiago de Cuba. They're occurring in Camagüey. They're happening in Las Tunas. These are places that we don't see unrest usually in Cuba. And the population there is revolting on a few things: food shortages, medicine shortages, and price hikes. They believe, the people of Cuba believe, that this can no longer continue. The system that they have in place is really putting them in a bind. Add that to a decrease in tourism because of the pandemic, you're not seeing the income come to the island that usually comes from Europe and from people from the United States and other parts of Latin America. So not only is this tourism industry decimated, the food shortages are really putting people in a bind, and we're seeing, as a result, people have no choice but to go to the streets and express their frustration. This is not the Cuba of 1959. The government cannot romanticize its revolution as it does in the past. It does not mean the same thing to the people of Cuba in 2021. This is a fundamentally different society, and like all countries and all civil societies, they're revolting against their government.
So, some activists have said that these sanctions are not enough. But I've also heard it said that, President Biden is in an odd position. He can come out very forcefully in support of the protests, but then that runs the risk of feeding into the narrative from the Cuban government that these protesters are, being inspired by or working with foreign actors who want to destroy the state. So I guess the question is, what can the president do that would have any sort of impact that would be supportive of the protesters?
You're absolutely right. Cuba is a relic of the Cold War. Every time there are protests, when they come from the society like Havana, the government will say this is U.S. inspired. These are the exile communities trying to unrest us. And this is because we haven't had a very detailed and honest discussion about the situation in Cuba. Look, the embargo has had an effect on the past half century or more. Yes, the Cold War has had an effect on both the exile community and the people of Cuba. But we have to have a discussion of what this means in 2021. And I also add that when the internet is shut down and we're not hearing the voices from Cuba, we're starting to hear voices. It's being substituted from protests in South Florida, in Miami or Tampa Bay. And one must realize this is drawing a big split among Latinos in the United States, because what I'm seeing on my social media feed, we recognize that you want to protest for democracy and human rights in Cuba. But at the same time, those communities in South Florida are not protesting when there are human rights violations in Georgia or voting rights violations in Georgia, when Black people in the United States are being beat by cops, when voting rights are being pushed back. So there's this very interesting discussion that's going on social media. Is this a myopic movement in the people of South Florida? Are you really interested in democracy in Cuba? Because the same things happen right now in Colombia. It's happening in Brazil. People are rising up against their government, and they're not necessarily leftist. In some cases, they're right-wing and authoritarian.
Russell, as you know, a number of high-profile artists and musicians have spoken out against the Cuban government. Could you say that they've laid the foundation for some of the protests that we're seeing now?
Absolutely. Some of these artists are going to YouTube. Some of them are in the exile community. Some are in Cuba. They have very popular followings on YouTube, on social media. And what they're doing is changing the conversation that we've had since the 1950s about what this means. These artists are saying we are, we're not necessarily arguing against our economic structure. We're arguing against our freedom of speech, the right to speak out against the government, which they believe is a fundamental right, the right to create music, the right to be not told what to believe. These are things that are going on, and they're very popular on social media. And here in the United States, they become into call celebs. Some of them all over YouTube, all over social media are very popular. People are listening to not only their speeches, but they're listening to music, and they're seeing this new movement that we haven't seen before.
Yeah, Russell, I wish we could talk to you a little bit longer, because that's the dilemma. One of the dilemmas for the Cuban government is that when they shut down the internet, and they have for a little bit, they lose a lot of money. So they can't actually afford to quiet these voices altogether. And so here we are watching these voices sort of add fuel to the fire and encourage people to hit the streets and protest. Russell, hopefully we can talk again sometime. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.